Hello, my name is Lydia, and this is my thesis project. And it has to do with college student anxiety and depression in the COVID-19 pandemic. If you're tired of hearing about COVID, it'll only be 15 minutes. So I structured this presentation around some questions that we're going to be looking at. So the first one is, what is the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic and physical distancing on college student anxiety and depression? So let's look at what things were like right before the pandemic. So historically, college students are considered a privileged, resourced, and healthy group, but they are a sizable population with distinct health needs. Over the past couple of decades, high and increasing rates of mental illnesses have been well documented. And we know that most mood and anxiety disorders, as well as substance use disorders, have an age of onset in the early 20s. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for young adults. And over the past couple decades, even though mental health stigma has decreased and the demand for mental health services has increased, we know that the availability of resources on most campuses has not increased enough. So long before the pandemic began, we have known that there's a mental health crisis on college campuses that has received attention from researchers and the public alike. This project is particularly focused on anxiety and depression, which are especially prevalent in this population. And in 2019, the National College Health Assessment found that around 20% of its respondents had been diagnosed with depression and 24% had been diagnosed with anxiety in the 12 months prior. So let's talk about observations during the pandemic. So by April 2020, the students that were mandated to relocate as a result of COVID-19 related closures reported higher grief, loneliness, and generalized anxiety. Students surveyed at the University of Texas had very high prevalences of depression and anxiety. And in the spring 2020 semester, 60% of college students who sought mental health services found them more difficult to access due to the pandemic. So there is accumulating evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic has alarmingly increased levels of distress, anxiety, and depression. So what aspects of this circumstance are unique to college students? Well, very few people have been unaffected by the pandemic, and there's a lot of stressors such as becoming seriously ill or dealing with the loss of loved ones, going through extended periods of unemployment and social isolation due to physical distancing. That last one is bolded because while it is impacting everyone, we know that loneliness and isolation affect the depression and anxiety of late adolescents and young adults more than people of other age groups, older adults. Specifically for college students, they've had to shift to remote and then to hybrid instruction. They have had to deal with uncertainty about their campus residential status and disruptions to student life. And in studies published over the summer, they report increased concerns about their academic performance that are centered on increased difficulty concentrating and disruptions to sleeping patterns. So for our project, we hypothesized that college students will show high rates of depression and anxiety. But let's look at some factors that could be protective. So the second question we're going to be looking at looks at social and university connectedness and their effect on depression, anxiety, and adherence to physical distancing guidelines. So social connectedness is defined as the subjective sense of belonging and bond people feel in relation to others, but it is different from belongingness in that it focuses on a person's relational schemas and patterns of interpersonal relatedness rather than the objective context of group membership. So it is often found to not be tightly bound to actual frequency of interaction with others or the size of their social circle. Nonetheless, it's integral to well-being, and it has been associated with increased empathy and, as a result, increased pro-social behavior. So in the past, low social connectedness has been correlated with concurrent depression, and it has been found to be a predictor for vulnerability to depression in the future. High social connectedness, on the other hand, is associated with lower perceived stress, lower COVID-19 specific worries, and lower fatigue in research published during the pandemic. Switching gears a little bit and talking about university connectedness, that's the student's perception that they belong, are personally accepted, respected, and included by peers and faculty at their college. And we know that students throughout this academic year and starting in March 2020 have had way less opportunity to interact with their with faculty and peers. Given its known impact on academic performance, anxiety, and depression, it is important to investigate further and look at how university connectedness could tie into this. So next, we hypothesized that high social and university connectedness will be correlated with lower depression and anxiety and higher adherence to physical distancing guidelines. This last bit was particularly included because adherence to physical distancing guidelines can be considered pro-social behavior. But let's look at our last question here. So how could attachment style impact connectedness, depression, anxiety, adherence to physical distancing, everything we've been looking at? So let's talk a little bit about attachment style. So while its initial aim was to study emotional development in the context of the attachment bond between children and their primary caregiver, later research has highlighted its role in peer relationships, relationships with strangers, emotion regulation, resilience, the list goes on. And it's been shown to play a protective role against depression and anxiety. Attachment anxiety has been associated with higher health anxiety. And in an Italian sample during the early stages of the pandemic, those with avoidant and secure attachment styles showed lower levels of distress. This was attributed to the higher levels of emotion regulation for the securely attached and the lower impact of social isolation on those with avoidant attachment style. So we hypothesized that people with high avoidance will also be experiencing lower social and university connectedness. We also had mediation hypotheses that were relating to attachment anxiety. So we hypothesized that social and university connectedness would mediate the relationship between attachment anxiety and depression and anxiety, as well as adherence to physical distancing. So let's take a look at this timeline. I just want to bring your attention to the last bit here. So data for this project was collected towards the end of the fall 2020 semester for UR students. So this was a time when there was vaccines hadn't been rolled out yet. There was a spike in COVID-19 cases across the US, and a lot of our students might have, or the students in our sample might have been traveling to complete the final bit of their semester online from home. So looking at methods, we administered 2 online surveys, one at baseline and one 14 days later. And our participants, again, were undergraduate UR students. Our methods were self-report measures, and the last one, the one looking at adherence to physical distancing, was created for this study and had Cronbach's alpha of 0.9, which was pretty good for face valid items created for this study particularly. So let's look at results, and if you're a visual person like I am, green results are consistent with the hypothesis, red are inconsistent with hypothesis. That doesn't mean that they're good or bad in terms of outcome. So the first question is, what is the effect of the pandemic? So we observed a relatively high prevalence of depression and anxiety. So 45.1% and 40.8% at baseline and follow-up exhibited moderate to severe levels of depression, and 34.6 and 28.8 exhibited moderate to severe anxiety. This graph looks a little bit like there's a change over time, but we did not observe significant longitudinal differences, so we were not able to statistically analyze longitudinally. We also did not observe a correlation between anxiety and depression and physical distancing. We attributed the lack of longitudinal differences in the relative stability of the constructs we were assessing due to the short time between the baseline and the follow-up was just 2 weeks. So looking at social and university connectedness, we found that high social connectedness and high university connectedness were associated with lower anxiety and depression. However, high social connectedness was correlated with lower adherence to physical distancing guidelines. Because this is correlational analysis, we can't really talk about directionality. So it could be going in the opposite direction. So people that are not adhering to physical distancing measures as much have more opportunities for contact with friends, and as a result score high in terms of social connectedness. However, there was no correlation between university connectedness and adherence to physical distancing. So next, looking at attachment avoidance and its relationship to social and university connectedness, high attachment avoidance was associated with lower social and university connectedness in our sample. And if you remember mediation analysis, we were looking at university connectedness as a mediator between attachment anxiety and depression, anxiety and adherence to physical distancing guidelines, but for different reasons, university connectedness was not a mediator here. However, social connectedness did mediate the relationship between attachment anxiety and depression, anxiety, and adherence to physical distancing. And you can take my word for it, or you can look at alphas and betas and the indirect effect within the confidence interval was also significant. Before we talk about conclusions, it's important to address some limitations very briefly. So the first of all, sample not necessarily very representative of the UR population or of the college student population in general. And we also had the confounding variable of, because students were traveling, some internationally, some to different states, it was difficult to know if, because of variability in physical distancing guidelines. When there was not enough time, as I said before, between the baseline survey and the follow-up, so correlation analysis does not imply causality, and the cross-sectional mediation analysis should be interpreted with caution. And finally, there's a strong correlation between social and university connectedness, so it's not certain that we might be looking at the same construct. Finally, conclusions. So we found that the prevalence of anxiety and depression in our sample was higher than in assessments prior to the pandemic, but was in line with recently published studies. Social connectedness and university connectedness were protective factors against depression and anxiety during a particularly distressing period. And because university connectedness was not associated with physical distancing, that means that universities are able to foster a sense of belonging among their students, even once physical distancing remains in place. Beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, social connectedness may act protectively even in the context of risk factors for anxiety and depression, such as high attachment anxiety. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.